Hey guys, I'm answering a comment here and I wish I could like share it, but it only lets me do that on my phone and it only lets me reply with like a 60-second video. And I tried like twice to make the 60 seconds, but I just don't think I can do it and have to recognize that I do not have a strength in keeping it always short, sweet, simple, to the point. So let me explain high pressure versus low pressure when it comes to the ventilator, specifically when it comes to a patient talking. There's a person who asked a question that they were struggling because they're seeing conflicting informations, whether if a patient can speak, whether it will be a low pressure alarm or whether it will be a high pressure alarm. So I'm specifically answering the question of if a patient is speaking, is it a high pressure alarm or low pressure alarm? So I think what this is referring to is something that's a little bit different than what it might seem. So as a whole, in general, if a patient that's intubated can't speak, they shouldn't be able to speak. They have, a balloon that's inflated in the what do you call it in the back of their throat. There's the balloon inflated, and so as long as this balloon's inflated, it actually prevents them from being able to speak. So they're going to try, they're going to mouth words, things like that, but they're not going to be able to speak. But because they're trying to speak, so they're trying to push air, they're awake, they're probably like blah, 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 blah. A lot of times they're cussing, it's really cute, and so, or they're saying unkind language, and so when they're talking a whole lot, it creates a high pressure, because high pressure alarms on the ventilator are all about too much pressure as a result of resistance. So there's some sort of resistance. So in my other video that talks about alarms, I talk about there's resistance because there's a kink in the tube, because there's too many secretions, the patient's awake and agitated, there's resistance in the lungs. So high pressure is there's resistance either in the tubing, in the person themselves. There's something that's creating it harder to get the air pushed in, or the oxygen, everything, the flow pushed into this patient. So if a patient was talking, imagine if you're trying to talk and you're awake and you're creating more pressure from the patient's side, it's going to create resistance for that, that ventilator to be able to do its job. So usually when it comes to a patient is talking, it's going to be a high pressure alarm. I think what the confusion might be is that if I have a patient who I can hear their voice, like they're sitting there screaming at me, again, if their tube is properly in place, I should not be able to hear them. But if their cuff starts to get deflated, then I could start to hear their voice. So for a low pressure alarm, this has to do with a cuff that explodes, blows, pops, a cuff that needs more air in it. It can be a hole in the tube, things like that. Like there is some sort of leak. So think low pressure is a leak, and there's either a leak in the cuff that stops them from being able to talk, that keeps that tube secure, or there's a leak somewhere in the tube itself, in the tubing, stuff like that. So I think the confusing thing here might be that when it's talking about a low pressure alarm, it depends on why the patient is talking. So if a patient is talking because they're awake, agitated, but you can't hear their voice, it should be a high pressure alarm. If the patient is awake, agitated, and you can hear their voice, it may be a low pressure alarm because there's a hole in that cuff, which is allowing you to hear their voice. Now, this is a very complex thing. So if you had a professor that really asked you, hey, you can hear their voice, would it be low pressure or high pressure? It may be both, because there's all that resistance and stuff like that, but there is that leak too, because that patient's probably awake if they're, trying to talk and do other stuff like that. So that's a really complex question. Now, I'm not judging, for those out there, if this professor's watching this, I'm not judging. But that's a little bit more intensive of a question, and for you to understand at a nursing school level. It's something you kind of learn with time. Like if I hear my patient's voice and they're intubated, I'm like, uh-oh, something's wrong with my cuff. And so that can lead to low pressure. So low pressure is a leak, and that leak could lead me to hearing a person's voice or hearing them talk. And that would probably be a low pressure alarm because there's a leak. Whereas most times when a patient is talking on the ventilator, I do not hear their voice and there's just a lot of pressure. So I guess I would say If a voice is present, the patient's awake, that tube's in the right place, probably high pressure because there's resistance. Whereas if there's a blown cuff, a hole in that cuff, a hole in that tube, otherwise something where I can actually now hear their voice, it's going to be low pressure, but it's not low pressure because they're talking. It's low pressure because of the cuff itself or what's going on with the cuff where now I can hear their voice. So hopefully, maybe this answers your question. I might be completely off guard. But again, this is a pretty deep thing. So if you are not the person who asked this question and I just confused the hell out of you, rewind and back it up and just forget anything I said and go back to the original video and don't get yourself confused. But hopefully this does help. So again, low pressure would just be for a leak, high pressures for resistance. I'm going to stop there before I talk myself into a corner, but I hope this helped. See you for the next one.